Hi, everybody. Welcome to Christian Homestead. My name is Jared. At the time that I'm recording this, it is 4:22 a.m. I have not been able to sleep. There's a number of things that have gone wrong, and I guess I'm just not getting sleep tonight. And yesterday, the new First Presidency was announced, and we are now officially transitioned over to President Dallin H's presidency. When I started my channel, President Russell M. Nelson was president of the church. And we have looked at him very closely because there's a lot of interesting things about President Nelson. And, this chapter is now over, and I want to transition over to President Oaks and see if we see similar things. This video is going to be a collection of some really initial interesting observations. We're mostly going to be looking at his talks that he's given ever since he started speaking in General Conference. We've done that with President Nelson and noticed some really interesting things with him. Well, now that I've done this exercise with President Oaks, there are also some very interesting things that I want to show you. And then there's a few other details that I want to point out. So let's just start here. This is his official profile page on the church website. The first thing I want to point out, and I haven't said this yet on the channel, I don't know if anybody else has elsewhere, but it's interesting that he was set apart on October 14th. Back during President Nelson's presidency, we would always refer back to when he was set apart. He was set apart on January 14th of 2018. I think that's really interesting. And frankly, I think it's kind of unlikely. There's all the other details to this as well. 7 days before October 14th was October 7th. That was the day that President Nelson had his funeral. And it was also the 2-year anniversary of the October 7th attack, which interestingly, after the funeral and before President Oaks being set apart, that war has come to an end, or at least seemingly so. At the very least, the hostages were released. That's really interesting. And then 7 days before the 7th is when, or wait, was it 7 days before that? I can't remember, but 7 days before General Conference. Yeah, 7 days before General Conference, that's when President Nelson passed away. But there's all just like these really interesting numbers. It makes me think back to something that President Nelson pointed out in his April 2024 General Conference talk called Rejoice in the Gift of Priesthood Keys. He said, "My dear brothers and sisters, today is an historic day for President Dallin H. Oaks and me. It was 40 years ago, on April 7th, 1984, when we were sustained to the quorum of the 12 apostles." And then you get footnote 1. Footnote 1 says, "I filled the vacancy of the quorum of the 12 left by the January 11th, 1983 death of Elder LeGrand Richards. Elder Oaks filled that which was left by the January 11th, 1984 death of Mark E. Peterson." I feel like President Nelson was trying to point something out here, not just, oh, isn't this, an interesting set of facts? Like, here's some trivia for you, for those of you that, like the details. No, let's think about that. These two apostles died exactly 1 year from each other. Exactly 1 year to the day. That's very strange. It's very unlikely. And then there's everything that happened in between. In 1983, there was the flooding in downtown Salt Lake, which was very unusual. You had State Street was turned into a river. The water came all the way up to Temple Square, essentially. We've looked at the pictures before. And then in this General Conference, just before President Oaks became president of the church, and while we had this apostolic interregnum, there was flooding in Salt Lake and in Tooele. But anyway, so let's get back to this. So they were both set apart on the 14th of the month. In this case, October. In the case of President Nelson, January. But the 14th. 14 is a significant number because it's a multiple of 7. I tend to think that that's why Joseph Smith had the first vision when he did. I feel like everything's according to divine timing. And with significant events, I feel like there's these signatures in the numbers. Joseph Smith was 14 when he had the first vision. So I feel like something's going on here. Okay, now the next thing, I was talking to my friend Troy with the Last Dispensation channel, and he pointed something out that I didn't know. He talked about the fact that, sorry, I'm so used to saying elder. President D. Todd Christofferson was an attorney. I didn't know that. I didn't know. So, of course, we know that about President Oaks. Let's just read a couple things here really quick, just so we get all the details. President Oaks is a graduate of BYU, 1954, and of the University of Chicago Law School, 1957. He practiced law and taught law in Chicago. Later on, it says he was a justice of the Utah Supreme Court from 1980 until his resignation in 1984 to accept his calling to the apostleship. He was a literal judge. Later on, he is the author or co-author of many books and articles on religious and legal subjects. In May 2013, the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty awarded him the Canterbury Medal for quote unquote courage in the defense of religious liberty. End quote. Well, let's look at President D. Todd Christofferson. It says, prior to his call to serve as a full-time general authority, Elder Christofferson was Associate General Counsel of Nations Bank Corporation, now Bank of America, in Charlotte, North Carolina. Previously, he was Senior Vice President and General Counsel for Commerce Union Bank of Tennessee in Nashville, where he was also active in community affairs and interfaith organizations. From 1975 to 1980, Elder Christofferson practiced law in Washington, D.C. After serving as a law clerk to U.S. District Judge John J. Sirica during the trials and other proceedings known as Watergate, which that's really interesting. That's something that Troy pointed out when we were talking on the phone. Born in American Fork, Utah, he graduated from high school in Somerset, New Jersey, and earned his bachelor's degree from BYU, where he was an Edwin S. Hinckley Scholar, and his law degree from Duke University. It makes sense now. It makes sense now why maybe he was chosen, especially in times like these, especially after everything that we saw in September with, what happened in at Utah Valley University the day after President Nelson's birthday, and then what happened in Michigan the day after his death, and just the general state of the world. And the church has been very, very focused lately. I'd say especially over I don't know how long, but it seems like I'm seeing more stories about the church focusing on religious liberty. It feels like there's been an uptick over the last few years. So maybe that's going to become even more of an issue, religious liberty, as well as, family proclamation issues. Things that different groups in the world are trying to do when it comes to family and morality, and where some of those interests conflict with the church. And so you get what I'm saying. So President Oaks is a prophet. And we know that prophets see around corners. And so I'd imagine that if we have these kind of things coming to us, that it'd be helpful to have two attorneys in the first presidency. Don't you think? It also kind of makes me think, I'm not saying that they are the two witnesses, but it's interesting that, witnesses, that's something that is part of, court trials. Sometimes you have to have witnesses, you have to get the story of what happened as someone's going through trial. And, witnesses and advocates. And recently I did a video about this recent church history conference where you had, several of the church historians. And one of them made the point, he was like, I've wondered why the Lord has had the church historian for the last few times be an attorney, someone who was previously an attorney. And he said, maybe it's because the advocate, meaning Christ, needs advocates when it comes to church history. And I thought that was a really interesting statement. And I feel like maybe something similar is going on here, where you have these advocates that are going to advocate for the advocate. Maybe we're looking at the two witnesses. I know recently I've been talking about President Jeffrey R. Holland, Caitlin with Anticipating Christ's Return. She's been talking about what seems like hints that he's dropped about him and President Nelson and going to Jerusalem. And in this last general conference, he talked about being in Jerusalem. He brought it up during the funeral that, he treasured that experience of him and President Nelson going to Jerusalem. And I'm with Caitlin when it comes to how that prophecy could be fulfilled. I'm open-minded. I feel like it could happen in different ways. Some people are very narrow in the way that they view things. But I tend to think that just all these apostles and prophets who have literally gone to Jerusalem could fulfill that prophecy. It's multiple witnesses. But we did have at the beginning of President Nelson's presidency, him and President Holland go to Jerusalem, and that's how he started his presidency. So just anyway, this is interesting to think about too. President Oaks, President Christofferson, both of them attorneys, and that's probably going to make them a pretty powerful team. Okay, so we got that. Let's move on. Okay, so this next portion, we're going to be talking about President Oaks' talks ever since he started speaking in General Conference. Why do I think that this is important to look at? Why do I think it's significant? Because, well, let's start with this one. Because I noticed pretty early on when I started this channel that there were really interesting things going on with President Nelson's talks. And it actually started with this spreadsheet. And this spreadsheet has developed over time. These are all President Nelson's talks once he became president of the church. And I noticed the number of times that he spoke in the first general conference as president of the church. And something just struck me about that. Did you know that he didn't speak? So President Monson passed away. Here's the next general conference. The new president of the church, President Nelson, did not speak until the Saturday evening session, which at that time was the general priesthood session. That's what got this ball rolling. And then I noticed that even after having started so late into conference, he spoke a total of 5 times. 5 times. So I was like, okay, what's going on? What's going on there? I looked at other general conferences. The next time he spoke 4 times, the next time 3 times, and then back to 4, and then back to 5. And I noticed that there was like this kind of mirroring thing, 5, 4, 3, 4, 5. So I was like, is there something in the middle? And there was. The middle talk, the April 2019 General Conference talk called Come Follow Me, is the one where he talked about Paradise, California. He showed this burnt down city. And then at the end of the talk, he said, time is running out. This is the middle talk of this pattern. And I was like, whoa, that is really, really interesting. Did he specifically plan it out that way? I don't know. Is this something that the Lord inspired and without President Nelson being aware? I don't know, but it happened. It's irrefutable. That's what happened. In the middle of this is time is running out. And I still think that applies today. I also noticed, so here you can kind of like see it right here. That's why I have these cells colored the way that I do. I also noticed that once he announced the renovation of the Salt Lake Temple, for 7 general conferences in a row, he would bring up the Salt Lake Temple and use it as an object lesson. For 7. And then he stopped. For 7 in a row. This is one of President Nelson's 7s. He did a lot of things in 7s. In fact, his first year as president of the church, he went on a global ministry tour, and guess how many countries he went to, including Israel? He went to 7. So that was interesting. Here are the number of temples that he announced per conference. There was only 1 temple that he announced outside of General Conference. Guess which number that was out of all the temples that he announced. It was his 70th temple, the Ephraim, Utah temple. The 70th one was the only one announced outside of General Conference. Now that his presidency is complete, it turns out that he himself announced 200 temples. So that's interesting that it ended on this like round number. He gave a total of 44 talks. I also tend to think that when you have like these double numbers, 11, 22, 33, 44, I feel like there's usually something to that. But anyway, so, and then when we go to this spreadsheet, this is all of his talks since he started speaking in General Conference. So he had one before he became an apostle. But this is how it went. He started speaking as an apostle in 1984. When you get to his last talk before becoming president of the church, that was his 70th talk. That was his 70th talk. We were just talking about 70 with the Ephraim, Utah temple. His last talk before becoming president of the church was his 70th talk. And then it turns out that his second coming talk was one of these multiples of 7. That's why I have all the 7 times 16. This is for like his total number of talks. Column K is for the number of talks since becoming president of the church. They both ended up lining up though. But this last multiple of 7, it happened to be his big second coming talk. And then what's also interesting is his final talk was called Confidence in the Presence of God. And he is now in the presence of God. So he gave a second coming talk. He had never given a bigger, more focused on the second coming talk. And then his last talk was having confidence in the presence of God. And that would be his last conference talk before passing away and going into the presence of God. So I feel like it highlights that final talk even more that he is now passed away. Now I feel like we need to be confident in the presence of God when Christ comes at the second coming. We also need to be confident if we pass away before that time. We need to be confident when we go to the temple, and so on and so forth. But that's how it played out. That was his last talk. So hopefully I've shown you enough things, if you're new to the channel, that you realize why I'm interested in this and why I would want to repeat this with President Oaks. So all that being said, let me show you what I found with President Oaks. And already there are some interesting things. Okay, so he spoke once before becoming an apostle, just like President Nelson. This was in 1971. And then here's his first talk as an apostle. Why do we serve? 1984. Okay, so I did the, 7 times 1 times 2, and so on. I decided to highlight these years where he spoke more than 2 times, because typically both him and President Nelson would speak twice a year, like once for each general conference. So his 21st talk, which is a multiple of 7, happened to be the middle of these 3 in this 1 year where he spoke 3 times. Not saying that there's anything highly significant about that. Just want to point it out. President Nelson, there were 2 years where he spoke 3 times. I don't have anything significant about that, but in 1987 and 1993. For President Oaks, just this one time in 1994. Okay, and then this kind of blew me away. His last talk before becoming a member of the First Presidency had to do with the family proclamation. His last talk before becoming a member of the First Presidency was about the family proclamation. Hopefully you see where I'm going with this, because his first talk before becoming president of the church during this apostolic interregnum, when he was technically president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, that talk was about the family proclamation. Isn't that interesting? Before the talk, before he makes these big transitions, this is what he spoke about, the family proclamation. I'm sorry, that cannot be coincidence. It can't. It cannot be coincidence. I noted that his 70th talk occurred during that first general conference, with him being first counselor in the First Presidency. And then his 77th talk took place in 2020, of all years. And this would have been the April 2020 General Conference. That's when he gave his 77th talk, was during that really important General Conference. I don't think that's coincidence. And then the last thing, I don't know. It's just kind of odd. His 93rd talk was this talk that was given in this last General Conference. And he's currently 93. That's the age at which he's becoming the president of the church. And that's the same age that President Nelson became president of the church. It's just so interesting to think about. I don't know that that means anything, but they both became president of the church. They were called together. They filled the spots of 2 apostles that died exactly 1 year apart. They were called together. And they both became presidents of the church at the same age, 93. And his first talk after the passing of President Nelson was his 93rd talk. It's just interesting. That's it. But it feels like things are starting to add up, just like President Nelson. And there's probably more, Oh, by the way, how did I do this? I used the scripture citation index. You can go down here to speakers and then select whoever you want. And then it'll bring up all their talks. So I just went one by one and copied over the titles of the talks. It just blows me away, you guys. It just blows me away. I don't know what to say. But I think that's all that I have for this one. I've got more work to do for sure. It's just going to take time, just like it did with President Nelson. But I feel like the Lord is in the details, that the Lord works through patterns. And I think that he leaves his signature with during significant times, both in our personal lives and also with leadership of the church. It really shouldn't be too surprising. Any one of these things may not mean some big grand thing. I think sometimes that's how people think, is like, well, what does it mean? You know, if there's not some big grand thing, then it must not mean anything. No, I think if you just take it all together and you look at the big picture, it does mean something. It means that God's in the details and he's orchestrating all of this. And when I say all of this, I'm talking about he's guiding his church, and it's according to his plan, and it's very specific and it's perfect. It may not be anything more than that, but it's really satisfying to observe these things. And I feel like it can build your testimony. Of course, you should have a testimony aside from just like looking at stuff like this, but I think it can add to it. So two attorneys in the first presidency. I think things are going to be interesting. Prophecy around corners. I think things are going to be interesting. This is one of the Davids. I'm not going to rehash that. I did it in the last couple of videos, but we have a member of the first presidency whose first name is David. I think that that's significant. Yeah. And just one more time, this whole thing started out, with the announcement yesterday. It started out with them sitting in front of that Second Coming picture, a painting. And the Second Coming was brought up. It wasn't the main topic, but it was brought up how all this that's happening right now is in preparation for the Second Coming. So, and one more thing about President Oaks. You'll remember I've talked about this recently. If we go to my spreadsheet called Prophets, Apostles, these are all the apostles in this dispensation. We have this really interesting occurrence where, oh, look. President Nelson, according to this list that I have, unless it's off, and it might be, but as I have it right now, President Nelson was the 93rd apostle in this dispensation. And if I'm wrong, because I might be missing somebody up here. If I add whoever that is, it may push this number down, and President Oaks might be the 93rd. Okay, that's probably going to have to be one of my next projects. But what I wanted to point out was before President Oaks, he had Russell M. Nelson, so Russell M. And then right after President Oaks, he had M. Russell Ballard. So Russell M. Russell, and President Oaks is in the middle, as though it's like pointing to him. I've always thought that was significant. So just another thing. Okay, well, that's going to be for this one. I'll talk to you guys later.